Hey guys, it's been a little bit, but I'm back. Well, I was never really gone. Just took a little break from videos. I didn't really have inspiration. But now we got a huge patch, and of course I got to talk about it. So, usually with patches, I'll look at the patch notes together and kind of like say my initial thoughts. However, most of the patch notes are just like, hey, we updated this visual effect, we changed this area, we changed this UI, etc. And so this patch is filled with a lot of art passes and a lot of quality of life. And so I'm not really going to be looking at the patch notes, but they will be linked in the description below. So what is the biggest change from the patch? Well, as you can see from this gameplay, which is from a game that I'm just spectating right now, there's now 3 lanes instead of 4. Now, what does that mean for Deadlock? Was this a good idea? Was this a bad idea? Obviously, I guess we'll see, right? But I want to talk about it a little bit and talk about some of the things that may or may not have led the developers to make this decision. So the first thing to know from this patch is that the side lanes from the geometry are actually quite similar. So as you can see here in the side lane, if you look at it, you know, not that much has really changed here. It's mostly the same. There's some additional pieces of cover since every lane is a dual lane now. But other than that, the lane itself is pretty much the same. You know, you can say the same for the other lane, other than in the sky, there's a giant bridge, but you know, the geometry is pretty similar. This area was changed. I mean, there's a bunch of changes, and I'm sure you guys will see all of them when you play the game. But the middle lane is now completely different. I mean, before there wasn't really a middle lane. There was 2 central lanes. Now there's one clearly middle lane, right? Which I think people will start to call the mid lane. And there's this giant kind of like tower-like thing, which resembles a little bit in design what was previously. And then Midboss is underneath mid, so you can access it either through these little zip lines or through this ramp right here. What does this actually mean for Deadlock? Well, the first thing is solo lane is gone. Now, people had mixed feelings about solo lane. On one hand, you had solo lane, which was like a very like fun like 1v1 environment initially, especially. And I think a lot of people really like having the fact that like, hey, if I'm a solo queuer, I know that I can play solo lane and control 100% of the variables that affect me, right? I don't have to lane with some random person. I know that for myself, right, if I wanted to like carry a game, for example, I felt more confident in the solo lane because in the dual lane, I'd be laning with some random person and I'd be like, okay, well, maybe this person is just going to have, you know, not really be on the same page as me, or is going to be worse than me, especially with matchmaking, etc., right? So that's definitely the first effect of them removing one lane. Now with solo lane, if you look at the things that people didn't like, I would say the main thing that people didn't like about solo lane is how easily it was affected by other lanes. So for example, if you were doing well in a solo lane, but your dual lane next to you was losing, well, it didn't really matter how well you were doing because the rotation time between lanes was like 5 seconds if you knew how to use zipline tech, right? So zipline tech made the rotation time between lanes extremely short. And so now the time between lanes is much longer once again. There are jump pads that you can use to facilitate the rotation, right? And so it's not like insanely long, but it is overall definitely longer. And ganking in the laning stage is definitely much more punished. The other thing is that before, ganking to the solo lanes was not really punished. 1, because of rotation time, but 2, because of soul sharing. So how soul sharing worked previously, I mean, it still works this way, is if you had 2 people in a lane, before 8 minutes, the souls were duplicated, meaning both people got 100% of the value of the souls. But if you had more than 2 people, then they were started to get split, so you got less souls, so you were kind of griefing. So if a dual lane, if one person went to gank the solo lane, well, then they wouldn't really lose anything, right? Because they would just get the value of the souls from the solo lane, and they wouldn't be losing anything. So they could just stay in that lane, get the wave, get whatever they wanted, and they wouldn't really get punished. Now, if you want to gank another lane, you're ganking a dual lane, meaning there's more than 2 people. And if there's more than 2 people, then you're going to be kind of griefing the souls that the people get in that lane, yourself included. So the risk to reward ratio makes a lot of more sense, in my opinion. You can still gank. I've been experimenting with it, and we'll see kind of how the meta develops. It might be too punishing, but I think it's just right the way it is right now. It shouldn't be that easy to gank like super early into a game, right? It should be something that's either only possible slightly later or has like a decent amount of risk related to it, which there wasn't in the past. So that's the first thing to consider. Now I want to talk about another reason why I believe the developers may have made this change. So in the previous map, one thing is there was 4 lanes, and what does 4 lanes mean? 4 lanes means that you're always having to deal with waves, right? So you're always having to deal with troopers, you're always having to manage waves. And especially in non-organized play, that became quite of an issue, right? Where very often your team would just like forget about waves for a little bit, and then all of a sudden you would lose 2 walkers and get snowballed out of the game because of how many souls the walkers gave, right? So the fact that now there's only 3 lanes to manage makes it much harder to get kind of like, I guess, cheesed in an unorganized play situation. In organized play, I don't think this was as much of an issue, but I do think that this will significantly change the meta in both organized play and unorganized play, because now there's a lot more space to make things like jungle invade and other things like that, just because, you know, there's so much more space on the map because you only have to deal with three lanes now. The other thing that 3 lanes versus 4 lanes changes is the time to move around the map in general. So it's not just to move between lanes, but zip lines are movement, right? Especially since they haven't removed the zipline tech. So if you guys don't know what I'm talking about, when you press control to get off the zipline, you maintain your momentum. So you can use like the aerial momentum in order to, you know, travel a lot of distance. And they haven't removed that, and so ziplines are essentially like the most broken movement in the game, especially if you have things like superior stamina or other things like that. And the removing one zipline essentially limits everyone's mobility a little bit. Now this is definitely a buff to characters that have inherent mobility, and definitely a nerf to characters that do not have any inherent mobility. So for example, this is, you could see this as a nerf to a hero like Geist, which has no way to really get around the map easier, and a buff to a hero like Haze, who has Smoke Bomb, which gives her a ton of sprint speed. Now, this slower rotation speed around the map does change a few things, but one thing that it does change is that you are going to be slower to respond to things on the map, right? You're going to need to make a little bit more predictive plays, because before, a lot of the time, no matter where a fight, you know, took place, you could pretty much show up there in like 5 seconds and it would be chill. Just because of zipline tech, but now you can't really do that anymore. Now, one of the other big changes from this patch as well is the fact that you no longer need to last hit troopers to get the soul values. You do still need to secure the soul, otherwise you can get denied for 50% of the value, but you don't need to get the final hit on it to drop the soul orb. So this is a pretty huge change, considering that, you know, they haven't really done anything like this ever since I've been part of the playtest, which is around May. And I think the main reason they did this is because people were missing troopers very, very often, just like straight up, like, you know, missing the last hit, or like they were dying around corners. And I think that this was exacerbated by the fact that the like trooper AI is like terrible, and it's still kind of terrible, although it does seem to be better. I haven't seen as many, you know, floating troopers or things like that. But with the terrible trooper AI as well as some other things, it just made it so a lot of people were missing troopers, especially, you know, Wars players, right, or newer players. And so I think that this change, you know, it does make the game more accessible to like your more average player, and I think that's a fantastic thing. And I don't think it really comes at the expense of skill expression, right? Because I think that there's still a ton of skill expression in the game in many, many different ways. And so I think that they just made this one part of the game a little bit more accessible, which in my opinion is a great thing, and I hope that they continue to make changes in that direction, which is, hey, let's make the game accessible, but let's not make the game easy, right? You want the game to have skill depth, you want the game to have skill expression, and I think generally speaking, Valve has shown that they're quite good at making those types of changes, especially with a game like Dota, for example, with like the Roshan timers and the Aegis timers, and adding quality of life changes, right, that are just really nice, but don't remove the skill expression from the game. Now, the last major change I want to talk about is the new location of Midboss. So Midboss being underneath, right? So if you go like through one of these zip lines, you go under, and now the entire arena is fully underground. And then there's these giant stairs that slide down. So one thing that I would suggest, and obviously I've already submitted this as feedback to the developers, but is that I believe that these stairs are a little weird, and the main reason why they're a little weird is because they give a direct sightline into the Midboss pit. So if you're standing up here and you're Bebop, I've tested this, you can like ult into the mid-boss pit as Bebop, for example. You can also hook. I mean, any character that has abilities they can just throw from a distance can just throw their ability directly into the pit from all the way up here, which seems a little insane. But other than that, I think that it's a step in the right direction. This makes mid-boss pit a little bit harder to access from, you know, everywhere on the map. The travel time to it from most places is heightened, especially because of the fact that there's not 4 zip lines, right? So if you win a fight somewhere on the side lane, like let's say here, well, chances are you're not going to be able to mid-boss if it's early in the game, or you might be able to mid-boss, but it's going to take a while. And also mid-bossing is a little bit more punishing now, just because it's easier to play for what I would call exit kills, right? Because once people are in the arena, you obviously have a huge advantage fighting them out of the arena, right? So you can decide where you ambush, but realistically the main ways that they only have so many exits, right? Like they have an exit through here, so you could decide to ambush them here. They have an exit through the other zip, and then they have both stairs, and all of the exits are like extremely like small and narrow, right? Like technically they could maybe exit through this if they have some sort of movement, but even then they have to go through some fairly narrow exits. So no matter where they are, they'll have to fight through chokes, which makes it a lot more punishing to do mid boss and get away safely. Overall, my impressions so far, I've played about 16 games. Yesterday I really grinded. I streamed for I think 10 hours. By the way, if you guys don't know, I stream on Twitch and YouTube pretty much, you know, most days, not every day, but yeah. And my impressions of the patch are very positive so far. I'm having a lot of fun. I think it makes the game very dynamic. I know some people have been saying that it made their games longer. I actually haven't really experienced that. Most of my games have been around 35 minutes. Obviously, you know, I'm a higher rank, so this may not represent, you know, the average person's experience. But yeah, I haven't really experienced too many like super long games or anything like that, and a lot of my games have been filled with like super fun team fights. And as we can see in this game that I'm spectating, I mean, there's, you know, there's 66 kills in 16 minutes, which is a ton of kills. So I think that this is gonna probably change the game for the better overall. We'll see. Obviously nobody knows how to play the game yet, and if you guys don't know, there's gonna be a Deadlock Fight Night. The tournament is happening every Wednesday, including tonight. And I'm going to be participating in the North American version, and I'm going to be streaming, watching the European version for a little bit. So if you guys are interested, check that out. I think it's going to be really fun with the new patch. Nobody's going to know what they're doing, so it's going to be a bit of a clown fiesta, but I think that's the best type of content. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I'll be sure to make some more videos about the new map and how this affects the meta, and, you know, you guys, you know, can expect a meta report this time for real, no lie. And I'll catch you guys next time.